Right, we've made it over to chapter 24 of Acts. Man, we are just moving right along. Can you all hear me out there? Okay. Am I on in there, Peter? All right. I heard that. So before we begin, we're going to have a word of prayer. Johnny, how's Aiden?
We got a pretty good report from the doctor. They thought it was at first a virus, but he went and saw a cornea specialist, and they got a swallow in his eye. Amy just sent me a message. He said the culture just came back and did a staph and microbacteria ongoing infection.
Oh my, okay.
You got to do eye drops 4 times a day before.
Okay, so that'll take care of it. Well, that's good. So he has a type of a staph in his eye. Okay. So we're going to keep Aiden in our prayers. Nicole and Blakeland left today to go visit in Memphis. I think they're going to head back on Wednesday. Blakeland doesn't have to, she's working, doing her work from home. So she doesn't actually have to be at her job site until Thursday, so she can do it from home. So they're going to go visit in Memphis, so they're going to come back. So they're traveling. You know, we haven't mentioned Sister Twitchell in a while. She fell and broke her femur bone here several weeks ago, and that's where Brother Twitchell has been, so let's continue to remember her. I had gone up to Oak Ridge, was it Friday morning I went? I think it was Friday morning, and I spent the weekend up there with Sister Marynell Hawcom, and she's a close friend of mine, and she might be watching us right now if she feels like it, and so we're going to say hello to her. She had a pretty rough weekend up in the hospital. She's doing a little better right now. So we're going to continue to pray for her. She is the good sister who blessed us with this video setup so we can stream our class lessons. So we're thankful to her for that. I've known her for nearly 20 years. So we're going to pray for her, and we just got a whole bunch of folks that we need to keep in our prayers. So before we do that, begin class, we're going to ask Brother Reggie to lead us in a prayer. All right, Acts chapter 24. I went up to all that trouble to put pronunciation marks, and I put the wrong one. I was looking at a different pronunciation of Tertullus because I had always pronounced it Tertullus, and that ends up being the correct pronunciation. I'm looking in my small book. I'd looked in a different pronunciation. I thought it was Tertullus, and that is incorrect. So pay no attention to your notes. It is not Tertullus. It is Tertullus. So I'm looking in the Bible here in my small book. So I'll just stick with what I've always called it, Tertullus. So pay no attention to your notes. All that trouble I went to. Okay. Acts chapter 24. And after 5 days, Ananias, the high priest descended with the elders and with a certain orator named Tertullus, who informed the governor against Paul. So, when we get over to chapter 24, we see these first 9 verses. What we look back and we notice that Paul's enemies have done is they attempted mob action. They tried to kill the man, and all that failed. Everything they've done up to this point has not turned out the way they wanted it to turn out. So now they go to oratory. They're going to try flamboyant speeches to try to destroy Paul. And it says, 5 days after having been taken from Jerusalem to Caesarea, the high priest with the elders and this man called Tertullus accused Paul before Felix. Now, Paul had been in Jerusalem about 7 days. We're going to notice, or we look back in chapter 21. The trial was 12 days after his having arrived in Jerusalem. So that's where we get this 5 days. Okay? The high priest and the elders made the trip, and that shows how important this situation is. They were willing to make this trip to stand before Felix to accuse Paul. They set forth the formal and baseless charges against Paul. They weren't able to prove any of them, but nonetheless, they set forth the charges. Brother Bowles noted that Tertullus was a Roman lawyer. And many of the lawyers, like lawyers in our time, they have to kind of sharpen their teeth in different places. They have to get in their practice. So the lawyers would go around the provinces and they would take cases and they would practice their art. And that's what we have Tertullus doing here. He's going to, the Jews hired him, so he's going to go and put on this show before Felix. And so in verse 6 we see that Tertullus spoke of himself as being a Jew when he made that statement, our law. So Tertullus was either born a Jew or he was converted to Judaism, one or the other. But when he was called forth to accuse Paul, he began by complimenting Felix. He began to flatter the governor. You know, have you ever been around someone that they're just too nice? They're just throwing compliments all over the place. You know, that's kind of a red flag, isn't it? It's just not normal. They're just throwing too much sweet on you. Okay? That's what Tertullus is doing here. He credited the Roman governor for all the quietness that the citizens enjoyed at the time. It was very peaceful in the area. Now, that wasn't undeserved for Felix. Felix had done a good job doing that. He had restored the peace. Hordes of robbers had caused problems. They had organized bands of assassins. And more recently, if you recall, back in chapter 21, they mistook Paul for that Egyptian whom Lysias asked him if he was that person. See, that Egyptian had stirred up some problems. He had come against the Roman government. So there was some issues in the area. And Felix had tamped down the problem. So it wasn't like he hadn't done some good things. But Tertullus was just using flattery. He was trying to use this technique to get on the good side of Felix, to win the case simply by flattering the governor. But Tertullus did not mention the historical fact also that Felix had assassinated one of the other high priests. He had Jonathan assassinated. And he went on to express gratitude to the governor for some of the other benefits that had taken place. And I've got some other information here about the governor here that would be interesting to you, that was found in Josephus' book of Antiquities. I'll put that in there for you. But anyway, he continued his flattery by saying he didn't want to further be tedious by reciting all of the other good things that Felix had done for the people. So he begged for his clemency or his mercy, so he might listen to those few words. Well, here are the 4 accusations, plainly stated, but no proof offered, that they leveled against Paul. First of all, he was accused of being a pestilent fellow. Well, that was rude, calling Paul a pestilent fellow. Well, to be pestilent means to be one who creates trouble and is injurious to peace. Well, Paul had been at one time a very pestilent fellow, if we want to look at the definition to that word. But he brought injury and even death to Christians, not to Jews. So they were accusing him of being a pestilent fellow toward the Jewish people. But he wasn't. He was a Jew working for the Jewish religion, and he was pestilent toward Christianity. So he's a Jew by birth, but he is a Christian by religion, and he is not pestilent at all toward the Jewish people or toward the Jewish religion. In fact, he's not pestilent toward anyone, is he? But who's going to see Christians as pests? Non-Christians, Satan, the world, people who want to live sinful lifestyles. They're definitely going to see Christians as pests. Well, then he was charged with being an insurrectionist. Roman authorities were one of the quickest governments to squash any kind of a rebellion, and they would do it, boy, with a heavy hand, and they were ruthless. They wanted to take the fight right out of their enemies. So they wanted to bring this charge up, thinking that it would really have an opportunity to anger Felix toward Paul. Now, keep in mind, if you were a governor in the Roman Empire over any of the provinces, if you could not handle the province, the king would have you deposed. He might have you killed, and at the very best, you would be stuck off somewhere to die a very lonely, hard life. And so this was something that, by design, they would throw that out there. Oh, he's an insurrectionist. Well, the gospel never incited anybody to a riot. The gospel never incited anyone to harm another person physically or take over a government or to do anything like that. In fact, Christianity teaches you to be in subjection to the higher powers, doesn't it? Romans chapter 13. It teaches you to pray for the leaders of your government, 1 Timothy chapter 2. So, this wasn't any kind of a charge that could be proven against Paul in any way whatsoever. Now, Paul and the other faithful Christians who taught and preached and carried the gospel throughout the world, they exposed idolatry, they exposed sin, they exposed error through the preaching of the gospel, but that didn't impact the government of the Roman Empire. They weren't trying to depose the king, but it simply impacted religious error. Then they accused Paul of being a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Well, that wasn't a compliment. It wasn't intended to be a compliment. Instead, it was an accusation. Tertullian was belittling the body of Christ, and he was ridiculing Paul. Why would he call them a sect of the Nazarenes? Where'd that come from? Jesus was from Nazareth. Did the place of Nazareth, did it have a good name for producing high-level people? No, it didn't. So he was using that to belittle Paul. Oh, well, you're a sect of that group of people that doesn't produce anyone that we might say is a high-producing, high-functioning, someone that's going to really bring something to society. Oh, it's Jesus of Nazareth. You're a Nazarene. Well, see, that wasn't a compliment. And just because he was called a sect of the Nazarenes. What's happened over time, and now in the modern world, we have a denomination called the Nazarenes. Well, that doesn't give us any authority to create a church called the Nazarene Church. That wasn't something of a compliment that we have here. Those who promote that, they're just promoting error, and it goes against everything that is taught in the Bible. But by calling Paul a ringleader, what Tertullus was accusing Paul of was being a prominent member of some despised sect. But there's no crime in being a member, or there was no crime, and there's not today, obviously, of being a member of the Lord's church, unless they could prove that that violated Roman law at that time. And see, they couldn't prove that. They could not prove that because, and we're going to notice, Paul admitted to worshiping the God of his fathers. And Roman citizens could, and they had the right to worship the way they wanted to worship within their religion. The Jewish religion was an accepted religion in the Roman, within the Roman government. Okay? And what Paul recognized was that Christianity was the fulfillment of the Jewish religion. And so he was worshiping the God of his fathers. So he wasn't creating some kind of a new religion. It was a fulfillment of the prophets, wasn't it? A fulfillment of the prophecies of the old law. Then he was accused of attempting to profane the Jewish temple. Well, what Tertullus was saying is that if Paul had profaned the temple, that had nothing to do with Roman law. And Tertullus says, well, we were going to handle it according to our law, and the chief captain interfered. Well, that was a serious charge to the Jews. But again, there was no evidence that Paul did that or attempted to do that. In fact, when he came to Jerusalem, he was bringing a gift to the Jewish Christians from the Gentile Christians, wasn't he? And he was going through this purification rite, this sanctification rite, to gain approval from the Jews. So, he knew that if he had brought a Gentile into the temple, that would have destroyed that whole purpose. So there was no kind of a proof that Paul had profaned the temple or was even attempting to profane the temple. So, as Tertullus continued his speech, he was stating that the Jews had apprehended Paul and they were attempting to judge him according to their laws, their religious laws, and Lysias disrupted their plans. Well, what were they really in the process of doing? They were going to murder Paul. They were going to kill him. Now, if the temple was going to would have been profaned, it would not have been profaned by anything Paul did. It would have been profaned by the blood of Paul. That's why they wanted to slam those doors shut, to prevent his blood from profaning the temple. They intended, there's no doubt in my mind, they intended on murdering that man. And Lysias came in there and rescued him. Now notice what Tertullus said. He added that they freed Paul from the Jews with great violence. Well, we read the account. There was no great violence on the part of the chief captain freeing Paul. But there certainly was great violence. There was going to be great violence on the other side of that. They were going to kill him. And you can see that Tertullus is using all of the great characteristics of politicians today as he stretches and bends and adds to the truth of what actually happened in that account. And then he concluded his speech by stating that Lysias, the chief captain over the Roman garrison, had commanded Paul's accusers to make the trip to Caesarea to make their case before Felix. You see, they didn't want to do that, did they? They wanted to lay hands on him right there in that spot, take care of Paul, have their problems finished. And then he added that Felix could verify all those matters if he examined Lysias, and Lysias testified before him. And all those who were with their man Tertullus agreed with him. And that was the end of Tertullus' great oratory speech. Any comments, questions? Well, let's move into verses 10 through 21. Paul's defense. Paul does speak for himself on this occasion. Felix motioned to him to speak, and he called attention to the fact that the governor had been in office for many years. And he made the statement that he was glad to speak for himself. He would speak up, and he would answer the charges that they laid against him. And he did address each of those charges. And he showed that there were no foundational evidences for those charges to be made against him, and that there was no truth in them. And notice what he says against the first one. He says it had only been 12 days since he had come up to Jerusalem to worship. Now, let's look at that. 12 days. Now, 5 of those days had been spent traveling under guard. Okay, now, the Romans had him under guard for 5 of those 12 days. He had only been in Jerusalem for 7 days. Now, 1 of those days he was in custody in the castle. So 6 of those days he had been under guard by the Roman government. What kind of insurrection can you raise, can you put together, can you overthrow the Roman government and put a plan together and do that in 6 days? Well, it's ridiculous, isn't it? So that's what Paul is stating, and that's what he means when he says, well, it had only been 12 days since he came up to Jerusalem. And he denied they had found him in the temple disputing with anyone or trying to stir up the people. He had done none of those things in the synagogue or the city, so he categorically denied the accusations. So here the apostle declared that his enemies can prove none of the charges, and the burden of proof has to be upon those who make the charge. Now, when we look back at Galatians 4:4, and we talk about the fullness of time, and we talk about the perfect time when Jesus comes into the history of humanity, and all those things that were added to the time that made it perfect. You had the law, and Brother Jim was talking about it. One aspect of that tonight, what did the kingdom of the Persians add to the fullness of time? Well, they had a law that once you made the law, that was it, wasn't it? Well, what did the Greeks add to it? Well, they added a universal language. The Romans added ease of travel, and they added upon the law that was a protection in that citizens had rights to be able to live peaceably and things like that. And Paul used that, and we've noticed, and we're going to notice, and have been seeing that he used his right as a Roman citizen. And so we see that all of that kind of is showing itself as he is standing and making his claim that they're accusing him of something, but they can't prove it. And he's making those points. The burden of proof has to be upon the one making the charge. So again, he admitted he worships the God of his fathers, like we noticed a minute ago. He can't be charged with establishing a new religion according to the law of Rome. Now, is Christianity different from Judaism? Well, yeah, of course it is. But according to the law of Rome at that time, he's worshiping the God of his fathers. They can't accuse him of trying to establish a new religion, because Christianity is a fulfillment of the prophecies of the Old Testament prophets. And believing the Old Testament, he's not going to have done anything to profane the temple. He'd gone to purify himself, right? Well, that would be counterproductive if he's trying to teach the Jews, wouldn't it? If you're going to unnecessarily offend a group of people, how far are you going to get in trying to teach someone the gospel? Well, it's not going to help your cause at all, is it? And so, what they're saying, they can't make the charges stick to him. So again, what he brings up the real reason that he has all these charges brought against him. He mentioned his belief in the resurrection of the dead, just as many of his enemies believed. A resurrection including the just and the unjust, a singular, universal resurrection affecting the dead regardless of their spiritual condition. And that statement made by the apostle is a critical blow to materialists who deny the unrighteous will be raised in the resurrection. And so we look at the statements that he's making here, and he's answering the charges as they come. And so once again, Paul affirmed his sincerity in the practice of his religion. And I think that's very important as he stands up and he's defending himself. He's not backing off of his faith or his belief in Christ Jesus, the promised Messiah. So as we look at him standing before these Jews, he is not relinquishing the fact that Christ Jesus was that promised Messiah. You see just the courage that we see in the Apostle Paul. It's absolutely astounding. He could have folded. He could have just simply given in to them and gotten out of this immediate trouble and then gone off and preached the gospel. He didn't do that. If it cost him his life, it cost him his life. He knew when he went to Jerusalem initially, he was going to be put in bonds. They begged and pleaded with him not to go. He said, if I go and die, that's what's going to happen. And so he's standing before the governor, and he is absolutely hanging on to his faith. He wanted to live in such a way that he was not going to be offensive to God or his fellow men, but he was not going to deny his faith. After many years of traveling through Gentile lands, he stated, as he is continuing to give a defense of himself, he had returned to Jerusalem, bringing this gift, an offering to the Jewish Christians in need. And he says that fact could be easily confirmed. All they had to do was talk to the eldership there in Jerusalem, and his sincerity in practicing Christianity combined with his interest in the welfare of his nation, not just with Christian Jews, with Israel in general, proves that he wasn't an insurrectionist. He wasn't trying to cause a riot everywhere he went. He was looking out for what was best for people in general. And Christ, Paul, and Peter, they all demonstrated those who please God will support their civil government. When do we not support the civil government? When it violates the precepts and the commandments God has put forth. That's the only time we do not obey the government under which we live. Okay, we may not appreciate the style of government. We may not like how they do things, but unless it violates God's laws, we do what they tell us to do. How many of us enjoy paying taxes? Boy, it's that time of year. I do not enjoy it. But, listen, it doesn't violate God's laws. In fact, Jesus paid taxes, right? We have to pay them. Certain Jews from Asia had found Paul in the temple. He'd been purified according to the law. They did not find him among the multitude trying to incite them, nor did they find him within a riot itself. They couldn't say he was doing any of that. So, for a proper court to be held, those Jews should have been present during the proceedings to present their testimony if they had a legitimate complaint. Since they weren't there, Paul insisted those who were there should be called on to explain what he had done wrong if they had discovered anything when he stood before their council back in Jerusalem. But they'd come all the way from Jerusalem to Caesarea to lay charges against him, but they weren't even there when the things had happened, but they couldn't find him guilty of anything when he stood before them initially back in Jerusalem. So with that concluding remark, Paul let Felix know the real cause of the charges was the sectarian hatred they had for him. Paul had cried out before that Jewish council. He says, touching the resurrection of the dead, I am called in question by you this day. So that broke up the council meeting by dividing the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And you recall that was one of the great moments that we see. One of the Paul was brilliant in that case. So after Felix, having heard the witnesses up to that point, he decided to wait until Lycia could come to Caesarea and present his testimony. Now, in the meantime, Paul was going to be kept in custody. And of course, we know that he was going to be kept in custody for about 2 years. The main reason he was going to be kept in custody for about 2 years was they were looking for some money from Paul. They wanted a bribe. But while he was in jail, he was going to have a measure of freedom, and he could have visitors coming in and out, whoever he wanted to have. Now, that was going to, obviously, that's a penalty for Paul, but it did not give his enemies the satisfaction they wanted. What did they want to happen to Paul? They wanted him to be dead, didn't they? They wanted him to be killed. They said, if you recall, he didn't have a right to be alive in this world. They were so angry with him. So after an unspecified period of time passed, Felix and his wife Drusilla, who was a Jewish woman, they sent for Paul, and they wanted to hear about the faith that was in him. They wanted to hear about Christ. They wanted him to present the gospel to them. And so he did that. And he preached not only to them, but anyone who was within earshot. And it says, without holding anything back. And it's described as he reasoned with Felix rather. Now that was the usual way that is described. That was the usual way they taught. They reasoned. And we read that among inspired men of the first century. They didn't use the oratory gimmicks that Tertullus used. It was simply a straightforward presentation of the gospel. They talked about the straight facts. They had someone might say he brought the receipts, and he proved his point with Scripture. And Drusilla, of course, being a Jew, she would have known that. But notice what he reasoned about. He reasoned of righteousness. Righteousness is doing that which is right, obeying God. Righteousness is revealed in the gospel. It includes preaching the facts, preaching commands, warnings, promises, and it urges people to obey that. He reasoned with Felix about temperance, that is self-control. We are required to be moderate in things that are right and to totally abstain from evil things. And all are required to follow that. Now that's kind of odd maybe at first. We hear that. We are told to be moderate in things that are right. What would that mean? Why to be moderate in things that are right? Is it right to study the Bible? Okay. Should we study the Bible? Daily, I think. Should we study the Bible every waking hour? We have to work, don't we? Have to support our families. So speaking of work, it's right to work to support our families, isn't it? Should we work and miss congregating with the saints on the first day of the week? Does God find that acceptable? Well, I have to work, I have to support my family. But you never attend services. You never meet with the saints. You never do, maybe something happens on occasion that prevents that. And, anything could happen, but is that a regular thing? Is that more often than not? I mean, God knows our hearts, and we can come up with 1,000 excuses. So we have to moderate things that are right. Okay, so that's what He's talking about. Even things that are right, we have to moderate those things. Okay. He reasoned with Felix of the judgment to come. Many in the religious world have chosen to ignore the judgment. But the judgment cannot be ignored. Now, how did Felix respond to the information about the judgment? Scared him. He shook, didn't he? Did that matter, though? Did that change him? No. He decided to delay his obedience to some more convenient time. At a convenient time, I'll call you, he said. Now, as far as we know, and what is likely is that time never came. And that means that Felix would have died lost. Now, Felix was a dishonest man, and he wanted Paul to give him money. He thought, well, if Paul is this man that was able to gather up all this money and collect all this money for the poor folks in Jerusalem, surely he can collect money and pay his way out of prison. Could Paul probably have done that? Sure he could have. Would that have been the right thing to do? No, this is the same man that had reasoned with him about doing right. Paul's not going to do that. Well, after 2 years, Paul, still being in prison in Caesarea, Felix was replaced by Festus. And Festus, in keeping with Felix's plan, always trying to keep the Jews happy, kept Paul in custody. And at this point, Luke takes the reader to about 60 A.D., and that takes us to chapter 25. Any comments, questions? Well, charges alleged by the Jews against Paul, verses 1 through 5 of 25. Festus, being the new governor, arrived, and he replaces Felix and, of course, kept Paul in bonds. 3 days after he entered the province, he traveled to Jerusalem from Caesarea. And, of course, Jerusalem was the largest city in the province, and obviously it was the center of the Jewish population and the Jewish religion. So, to keep the constituency happy, you have to visit every once in a while, and that's what Festus decided to do. And I have some information there about Caesarea. But anyway, the high priest and other members of the council, they met with Festus, and they told on Paul a little bit. And what we learn here is even after 2 years, they still had this great grudge and hatred for Paul. And now what they are wanting is for Festus to send Paul back to Jerusalem. Now why do you think they would have wanted to have done that? They wanted to kill him. They want Paul dead. They still, after 2 long years, now of course they put it under the guise of he needs to stand before the council, but that's not really what it was. They wanted to have an opportunity to murder Paul on the journey back. But Festus, not being stupid, he declined, and he's going to keep Paul in Caesarea. He probably had some idea who he was dealing with there. And he probably didn't want to spend any more time in Jerusalem than absolutely necessary. And so, since he was returning shortly, he invited the council to Caesarea, and they could, as many as were able, could accompany him on the trip back, where they could accuse Paul of any wickedness that he had done. Now, how successful were they of that in the past? Well, they weren't. Well, we're going to notice that Paul is going to appeal to Caesar. After having spent about 10 days in Jerusalem, Festus returned. The next day he sat in judgment to hear Paul's case. Now the Jews, they had returned, some of them, and they were standing about when Paul was brought before the court. They leveled these grievous charges that Paul had done against him. Luke doesn't list them, but he does say they could not be proven. But as we listen to Paul's reply, the allegations must have been the same as the ones Tertullus had made in the previous chapter. And of course, Paul denied them. Now, we see how weak of a man Festus is just simply by the request he made in verse 9. He asked Paul if he was willing to go back to Jerusalem to face trial before the governor. Now, of course, he did that to try to keep the Jews happy, but I don't know that he necessarily knew that there was any type of a plot to murder Paul if he had made that trip back. But Paul, of course, he had every reason to believe that they wanted to murder him, and that he likely knew that if he went back to Jerusalem, they would find a way to end his life. Now, how does God's providence work? Well, God uses the natural occurrence of events to work His will. Now, if a person is going to jump off of a 50-story building, can God stop that through natural providence? No, because that's just the natural occurrence of events. If you jump off a 50-story building, gravity is going to usher you straight down to the sidewalk. So, if God's providence is going to work through Paul, Paul has to understand, hey, I can't go back to Jerusalem. Those crazy people there want to kill me. So, all the time Paul's wanting to go where? He's wanting to go to Rome, isn't he? Well, he doesn't want to go in chains, but look, if that's the only way you can go, that's how you have to go. And so Paul here reminds Festus that he's standing before Caesar's court, which was the proper place for his case to be heard, because he hadn't violated any Jewish law, which he reminded Festus was a fact that the governor should have already known. So, Paul, at that point, and this is a point that I like to use in support of capital punishment, Paul makes the statement here, if I've done anything worthy of death, he says, I'll accept that. But I haven't. I haven't done anything worthy of the penalty of death. They can't substantiate that. So he refused to be turned over to the Jews. And it is at that point that he made his formal appeal to have his case heard by Caesar. So, there's no miracle here, but there is providence, I believe. And so, Paul is headed to Rome. And who is the Caesar on the throne at this time? Nero, one of the most diabolical men to ever sit on the throne in Rome. So we see Paul's citizenship has saved his life on this occasion, and it led to that fulfillment of the Lord's promise to Paul back in chapter 23. Nero, boy, he was terrible. He was homosexual. He openly practiced that sin. He murdered his wife. He murdered his mother, his brother. But the thing that bothered the people most was when he wore the royal robes and acted like an idiot in public. when he performed in the circuses. And so eventually they killed Nero. The people did. And Galba was replaced him. Anyway, I have some information there for you on Nero. So Paul stands before Agrippa and Bernice, verses 13 through 27, prior to going to Rome. But he is headed to Rome. After another period of time, King Agrippa and his sister Bernice came to Caesarea to greet Festus. Drusilla was also their sister. Agrippa sided with the Romans. That's why he's in the position he is during the war of 66 to 70. And he died in about 100 AD, the end of the century. Festus told Agrippa about Paul's case. He wanted some input from Agrippa because it was thought that he had a little more insight into the Jewish situation. And so while in Jerusalem, the Jews had asked Festus to declare judgment against Paul, but Festus told them that Roman law forbade condemning a man to death before the accused could stand before those who were accusing him. Now, does that sound familiar to us? Well, it ought to, because our law is very similar to that, right? We carried over a lot of our laws from that. And so Luke reported on the day following his return to Caesarea, Festus convened his court to hear Paul's case. The Jews stood up, brought charges. They were not those that Festus had anticipated. They were more along the lines of the religious type, and they were talking about Paul speaking to the fact that this man Jesus who was dead, Paul is affirming that he is still alive. And so Festus didn't know how to proceed with that case, and he asked if Paul was willing to return to Jerusalem. And then he told Agrippa Paul had appealed to Caesar, and Festus had decided to wait for a while to send the prisoner to Rome for the hearing of his case by higher court. Now, notice this. Verse 21 refers to Caesar as Augustus. Now, the very first person that we know as Augustus Caesar was Octavius. That's not this one, okay? That guy, he reigned from 27 BC to 14 AD. Augustus was just a title. That was given to that first guy, and it was handed on down. The Senate put that title on him, and it was kind of a title of deity. And the present Caesar had that title, and again, the present Caesar was Nero. This is the one before whom Paul is going to go to Rome, and it is the one who is going to ultimately have Paul killed. So all of this kind of gains Agrippa's interest, and so he wants to hear what Paul has to say, really out of curiosity. And so because of that, this prophecy, or the promise that the Lord had given Paul, was going to be fulfilled. And that promise was that Paul was going to do what? He was going to stand before kings and governors and rulers, right? Jews and Gentiles. And so he's going to stand before Agrippa, and he's going to speak to him as well. And later, even when he goes to Rome, we're going to find out when he writes that letter to the Philippians that there are Christians in Caesar's household. And so he stands before Agrippa and Bernice, and their chief captains and other principal men of the city there. Now, chief captain has 1,000 people under their command, or 1,000 soldiers rather. And Festus began his introductory statement by addressing Agrippa and the other important individuals there. And he said that Paul is the one about whom the multitude of Jews were greatly concerned, having cried out against him both at Jerusalem and Caesarea declaring that he had no right to live. Now that's a big statement, isn't it? You have to have a lot of hatred towards someone to make that kind of a statement. But anyway, Festus continued that he had examined him and that he found him innocent. He found him not guilty. Who else made a statement like that? If we go back and we look at the statement that Pilate made, didn't he say he found no guilt in Christ? But the Jews would not have it. We find this same situation with Paul. So he said Paul made an appeal to the emperor and he had decided to send him on to Rome. And so the bottom line here is they gathered because they had to make a formal charge. If they send Paul to Caesar without a formal charge, everybody involved is going to look stupid. So they have to come up with a reason. They're shipping this young man, or I don't know how young he is, he's older at this point, this man off to Rome to be charged. So they have to come up with something to allege against him as to why they're sending him to Rome to stand against Caesar. And so next week we're going to pick up, chapter 26. He's going to be talking to Agrippa, and we'll see chapter 27 as well, and we are right here at the end of the book. Thank you so much.